I was born in Wakefield in the West Riding, which is about 8 miles from Leeds, and all my earliest memories are of this tremendously industrial area where people seemed to get up to work at 5 a.m. and kept on till they had supper late at night. And the most powerful impression, I think, apart from the very fine natures of Yorkshire people, was the amazing difference between the industrial devastation, where everything was so dark and so black, and light never seemed to percolate at all, and the exquisite country far outside in the dales of Yorkshire, which I was able to enjoy with my father when I was not at school, who took me in his car. And the country, the unspoilt country there, was so magnificently shaped that the roads became, as it were, contours over a sculpture. And these great conflicting ideas of what man can do in the way of darkness and yet surmount spiritually, and what could be perceived in the countryside in the unspoilt way, really, I think, shaped my whole life. I came to Cornwall about 22 years ago, no more than that, I think, and just before the war. My triplet children were about 4 years old, and we'd been asked to come down here to stay with a friend, to give them a holiday, and we were offered shelter to keep the children here when war broke out, which it did within a couple of weeks. Before I came, I thought it was rather a fearful idea to come so far away to an artist colony. And very strangely, I'd worked in London before that, when I left the West Riding. A foreword to one of my exhibitions in 1937 had likened many of my works to many of the Cornish stones and cromlechs and dolmens, which I'd never seen, as I'd never been here. And I didn't want to come, but I found after a while that it was quite impossible to leave here. I am still completely in love with the place. No day is ever the same, and it is as near to my Yorkshire background because of the history of Cornwall, of tin mining and the strength of the countryside, the ravages in places of the industrial exploitations in the past, and the whole strength which lies behind the landscape. And I think also a great similarity between the people of the Cornish people, who are far-travelled, tremendously hardy, miners, sailors, and engineers, so that I felt immediately, spiritually at home. It has strengthened my work in the sense that I have an additional magnificent gift living here, which I never had in Yorkshire, and that is light and warmth and quietness, and the ability to use this in my carving out of doors, which of course would be impossible in the north of England. With all of the free works which I do for myself, I always imagine the sort of setting I would like to see them in, because I firmly believe that sculpture and forms generally grow in magnitude out in the open with space and distance and hills, so that the natural setting is the most tremendously inspiring one to me. And when I go out in the country here in Cornwall, motoring over the hills, I stop, and more often than not I make drawings not of what I'm looking at, but what springs into my mind as a form which I would love to make for such a landscape. And therefore the works I do are a mixture of an ideal situation in shape and spontaneity, reacting to landscape, and a feeling of evoking within how I feel myself bodily in relation to this landscape, evoking a response in the beholder to the position of man spiritually, mentally, in his landscape and relating to the universe. To follow through from that, I think it would be true to say that it is perfectly possible to be on a lonely hill, considering man's philosophic development and relation to life, and create a work which could transport the whole of this environment of the world in its absolute beauty, unspoilt beauty, and place it, say, in the middle of Piccadilly, and create the exact evocation of idea so that everything becomes quite stilled and controls the impetus which I think we suffer from of rushing and confusion, and create an exact response. I do believe in abstract work that it is possible for sculptors to create forms which, for instance, make man consider space, or traveling in space, or moving round the world as we now do, and produce this in the middle of the biggest hurly-burly, but still make it completely valid. That is, I don't wish to make a work fit for Piccadilly, but I would like to make what I most truly feel and put it into Piccadilly and say, here is something of myself, of Cornwall, of sky, sea, space, and let it tell in that environment. I so love carving. It seems to me the most rhythmical and marvelous way of working on live and sensuous material, because even if one has two pieces of the same stone, they have another nature, and every piece of wood and every piece of stone has its own particular live quality of growth, crystal structure, and one becomes utterly absorbed and blended rhythmically within the cutting of this. I think of all the activities, it is the most rhythmical. The left hand, as it were, does all the thinking, holding the chisel, and the right is merely a motor, and one gets a very easy rhythm which allows one's thoughts a completely free rein as one tries to make the forms and contours which will express oneself. And this really goes on right to the end, where the very final work, the finest rubbing and hand polishing, will reveal the state of mind of the artist and what he's trying to express. Before I start carving, or indeed making any work, being a carver, I do have a complete conception in my mind of the form I'm making. It is, I suppose, simply a faculty one happens to be born with, being able to see mentally all round the form before one begins. And I do find that if, for instance, architects ask for a maquette for a given position, that is one of the most difficult things, because my whole idea is to make a small maquette which will live as a small sculpture, but leave myself completely free, and indeed I always have to stipulate this, that when I work on a bigger scale, that it will change, because scale is all important. Man is only up to 6 foot high, and our whole vision changes according to height and breadth and depth. And it is a physical reaction which tells on all our spiritual perceptions. Therefore, I would prefer to make a maquette which looks terribly nice as a small sculpture and is exciting to me, and then act quite freely when I do much bigger work, to change and expand and alter wherever I feel the physical and spiritual necessity. I like to have a lot of my work somewhere near me, and the garden is a beautiful place to have it in, because often I go out in different lights, even in moonlight, in the middle of the night or at sunrise, because the changing light reveals so much with sculpture. It takes on an entirely new presence, and one can learn and be stimulated the whole time. If I'm deep in work on a particular new piece, I am, of course, entirely dedicated to that one, and until I've firmly established my thoughts on the material, I don't really pay much attention to anything else. But then I quite often have 2 or 3 things going, because I love to work regularly. And I have, say, a large work which is quite clearly defined, which I can work in fine weather, or indoors I can have a great piece of wood which I'm developing or has to be polished, or the fine work done. And I particularly love to have things related in a friendly and near way to human beings, so that they can be touched. The patina of people's hands is a wonderful thing on sculpture, and I really believe that through touching they can be deeply expressive to people. In fact, 1 or 2 letters I've had in the past years have been from people who were blind and who did, through their hands, really get the idea that I had been trying to express.